Mirror Incident. It was a cool autumn evening in Springfield, Missouri. Sarah Harper, a 22-year-old college student, had recently moved into her first apartment near campus. The place was small but cozy, filled with secondhand furniture, a few of her mom's old decorative pieces, and a large antique mirror that she had found at a yard sale. She loved the vintage feel of the mirror. Its wooden frame had a few cracks, but it added character. After a long day of classes and a shift at the local diner, Sarah finally settled into her new routine. Her roommate, Jenny, was out for the weekend visiting her parents, so she had the place to herself. She decided to unwind by watching some TV and scrolling through social media before heading to bed. Around 11 p.m., she turned off the TV, grabbed her phone, and walked to her bedroom. The hallway leading to her room had the mirror hanging at the end, right near the bathroom door. As she passed by the mirror, something made her pause. She glanced at her reflection and felt a strange sensation of being watched. Shaking off the feeling, she continued into her bedroom and got ready for bed. Lying down, she stared at the ceiling, trying to let her thoughts drift away, but she couldn't shake the odd feeling from earlier. She told herself it was just her imagination running wild from being alone. Around 1 a.m., she was startled awake by the sound of something falling in the hallway. The thud was followed by a soft creak, like someone walking slowly. Her heart raced. Was someone inside the apartment? She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight. Slowly, she opened her bedroom door and peeked out. The hallway was empty, but the middle seemed different. The air felt heavier, as if something was out of place. Sarah cautiously approached the mirror, her bare feet making almost no sound on the wooden floor. When she stood in front of the mirror, her reflection looked back at her, but something was wrong. The reflection of the hallway behind her wasn't empty. There was a figure standing there, just barely visible in the dim light. A tall, dark shape loomed behind her, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as though it were studying her. Sarah whipped around, expecting to find someone, but the hallway behind her was empty. She stared in disbelief. When she turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone, but her reflection seemed distorted, as if the glass were warped. She took a step back, trying to process what she had just seen. Her breath quickened, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Without thinking, she yanked the mirror off the wall and shoved it face down onto the floor. Terrified, she ran back to her bedroom and locked the door. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She stayed up for the rest of the night, too scared to sleep, her mind racing with thoughts of what she had just witnessed. The next morning, when Jenny returned, Sarah told her everything. Jenny, ever the skeptic, laughed it off, saying that Sarah must have been dreaming or that her mind was playing tricks on her from exhaustion. But Sarah couldn't shake the memory of that shadowy figure in the mirror. A few days later, they decided to get rid of the mirror. Sarah sold it online to a buyer who didn't ask many questions, but she never told them the real reason for selling it. She didn't want to think about what might still be lingering on the other side of that glass. From that day forward, Sarah avoided mirrors, especially in the dark. She couldn't help but wonder if the shadowy figure had been real, or if she had imagined the whole thing. But deep down, she knew the truth. There was something in that mirror, something that didn't belong, and she wasn't going to take any chances with it ever again. The Midnight Visitor. It was late November in a quiet town in northern Idaho. Michael Reed, a truck driver, was driving home with his wife, Rachel, and their teenage son, Sam, after visiting Rachel's family for Thanksgiving. The long stretch of road seemed endless, with nothing but the dark sky above and the barren fields on either side. Sam, sitting in the back seat, was dozing off when suddenly Rachel spotted someone on the side of the road, flagging them down. It was a man, drenched from head to toe as if he had been caught in a sudden downpour, though there hadn't been any rain that night. His clothes were ragged and his face, hidden under a baseball cap, was almost completely obscured by the shadows. "Should we stop?" Rachel asked, her voice uneasy. Michael slowed the car, unsure if they should. "Maybe he needs help," he muttered, pulling over to the side. The man approached, his movements stiff and awkward. Sam woke up just as the man reached the window, peering curiously at the stranger. The man leaned down, his face partially hidden by the brim of his cap. Car broke down, he said in a low voice. Mind giving me a lift to the nearest town? My place is just a mile ahead. Michael glanced at Rachel, who looked uncertain, then at Sam in the back seat, who had suddenly grown quiet. Sure. Get in, Michael said, unlocking the passenger door. The man hesitated for a second, then opened the door and sat down beside Michael, not saying a word. As they drove, Michael tried to make small talk, asking him where he was coming from and what happened to his car. The man's answers were short, vague. Something about his demeanor put Michael on edge. Sam leaned forward from the back seat, looking at the stranger with curiosity. He tried to lighten the mood by cracking a joke. Hey, you don't have a body in your trunk, do you? The man didn't laugh. He didn't even react. Instead, he just stared straight ahead, his fingers tapping rhythmically on his knee. The atmosphere in the car grew thick with tension. Michael's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Where exactly did you say your place was? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Just a little further up, the man said, his voice now barely above a whisper. After what felt like an eternity, the man finally pointed to a small dirt road off the main highway. Turn here, he instructed. Michael turned, following the narrow road deeper into the woods. The car's headlights illuminated the path, but beyond that, there was only darkness. Rachel glanced nervously at Michael. This was not a good idea. The road eventually led to an old, rundown farmhouse, barely visible in the moonlight. The man reached for the door handle, but before getting out, he turned to Michael, his face still hidden under the brim of his cap. Thanks for the ride, he said, his voice now eerily calm. You should leave now, and don't look back. Without another word, he stepped out of the car and disappeared into the shadows of the house. Michael felt a shiver run down his spine. Let's go, he said to Rachel and Sam, his voice shaking. He put the car in reverse, not daring to stay any longer than necessary. As they backed away, Michael's heart raced. He didn't look back at the farmhouse, but Sam, sitting in the back seat, couldn't resist. He turned his head, peering through the rear window. Dad, Sam whispered, his voice trembling. He's standing there, in the window, watching us. Michael pressed down on the gas, speeding back toward the highway. No one spoke for the rest of the drive home. That night, none of them could sleep. The man's haunting presence lingered in their minds, especially Sam's. He couldn't shake the image of the stranger standing in the farmhouse window, staring after them. The next day, Michael decided to drive back along that road, determined to find out more about the man. But when he reached the dirt road, it wasn't there. The farmhouse was gone, as if it had never existed. Michael stopped the car, staring at the empty field where the house should have been. Weird, he muttered to himself, trying to make sense of what had happened. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. Something about that night had been wrong from the start. As he drove home, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that they had encountered something or someone not of this world. And he knew, without a doubt, that they had been lucky to get away. This happened to a friend of mine in 2018. He's the most straightforward guy I know. He doesn't BS anyone. Not sure what this would classify as, but my friend owns a diving company that works on dams for the government. These dams are often located in rural areas. One particular dam was near a small town called Lakeside. The dams are usually on or near private property, and my friend knew the property owner from previous work in the area. The farmer offered them a free place to stay in one of the old farmhouses. The house was pretty basic, just a roof and walls with no furniture. The divers all brought their own beds and stretchers to sleep on. This type of work can take weeks, sometimes months to finish. So my friend would set everything up, get the crew started, and then drive home in the evening. After 3 days, he returned to check on the crew and help them finish the last few days on site. That evening, he went to the farmhouse and set up his bed in the main room where there was an old fireplace. The room was spacious, and he was confused to see that the other 5 divers were all sleeping in one smaller room. When he asked why, the men told him that every night they had experienced a heavy weight like hands or a belt pressing down onto their chests. The pressure would get stronger and stronger, and when they tried to resist, it got worse. They said it only lifted when they panicked, yelled, or made enough noise for one of the others to wake them, and tell them to stop thrashing around. Each one of the divers had experienced this during the nights they stayed there. My friend, who is quite religious, dismissed it at first, thinking the guys were just trying to mess with him. He set up his bed in the main room anyway, and one of the other divers decided to stay with him just in case. That night, my friend felt it too, a weight pressing down onto his chest. He assumed it was the other divers and shouted, "Quit messing around! I'm trying to sleep!" But when he looked up, there was no one above him. The pressure grew stronger, and it felt like his ribs were about to break. In a panic, he yelled for help, and the diver next to him jumped up and pulled the blanket off him. The weight lifted immediately. Shaken, my friend moved to the smaller room with the other divers to sleep. The next morning, he searched the main room for anything that could explain what had happened, and he found it. 3 urns that they had mistaken for empty plant pots. He spoke to the farmer, who had no idea the urns were there. Curious and alarmed, the farmer took the urns back to his house to investigate further. That night, the farmer and his wife experienced the same terrifying sensation that the divers had, an unbearable weight pressing down on them. The farmer, terrified, rushed over to the diver's hut in the middle of the night, visibly shaken. Like I said, my friend is deeply religious, and he had read or been told that one way to rid yourself of an object causing paranormal disturbances was to burn it. So he and the farmer, along with the help of the divers, started a fire and burned the urns. Father John. Father John Mendez had been transferred to St. Michael's Parish in downtown Chicago only a few months ago. At 31, he was still relatively young for a priest, but his sharp intellect and calm demeanor had quickly earned him respect within the diocese. His previous experience assisting with exorcisms in a small Pennsylvania parish was rare, even among clergy, but he had never led one on his own. That was about to change. One evening, Father John received a call from Bishop Daniels. The Malone family had reached out, desperate for help with their daughter, Margaret. The bishop's voice was stern, but there was an underlying urgency to it. "It's serious, John. You need to see this for yourself." Margaret Malone was just 12 years old, but in the past few months, her behavior had taken a terrifying turn. According to her parents, she had started to speak in voices that weren't her own, act violently, and show a strange aversion to religious symbols. They had taken her to doctors and psychologists, but no one could explain the sudden transformation. Her parents were convinced something darker was at play. Father John met the Malones at their modest suburban home just outside the city. Mr. and Mrs. Malone looked worn down as if they hadn't slept in weeks. Margaret's older brother, Brian, stood by silently, his eyes filled with fear and confusion. Mrs. Malone led Father John into Margaret's bedroom, her hands trembling. "She's been locked in there for her own safety," she whispered. "We didn't know what else to do." Father John nodded and asked to be left alone with the girl. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. The room was dimly lit by a small lamp on the nightstand, casting long shadows on the walls. Margaret sat on the bed, her hair disheveled, her eyes dark and sunken. She looked far older than 12. "Hello, Margaret," Father John said gently, approaching the bed. Margaret's head snapped up and she stared at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. She smiled, but it wasn't the smile of a child. It was twisted, unnatural. "Father John," she said, her voice low and guttural, completely unlike the voice of a young girl. "We've been waiting for you." He felt a chill run down his spine, but he kept his composure. "Who are you?" he asked calmly. Margaret, or whatever was inside her, let out a low, mocking laugh. "I am many," she replied, "and you are too late." Father John took out his Bible and began to read passages aloud, praying under his breath. Margaret's body tensed, her eyes rolling back into her head. She thrashed violently, the bed shaking beneath her. Her voice grew louder, deeper, and her words became a mix of different languages, some of which Father John didn't recognize. As he continued to pray, Margaret let out a piercing scream, then collapsed back onto the bed, unconscious. Father John paused, beads of sweat forming on his brow. He had seen enough to know that this was no ordinary case. The battle ahead would be difficult, and he would need the full authority of the church to proceed. After discussing the situation with the Malones and the bishop, Father John prepared for the formal rite of exorcism. It was a dangerous process, both spiritually and physically, and he made sure the Malones understood the risks. They were desperate. They agreed to anything that might save their daughter. The exorcism was scheduled for the following night. The Malones had gathered a few trusted family members and close friends to offer their prayers and support. Father John arrived with another priest, Father Thomas, to assist him in the rite. The room was filled with the scent of incense, and the walls were lined with religious artifacts, crucifixes, holy water, statues of saints. Margaret lay in the center of the room, her wrists and ankles tied to the bed for her own safety. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes half closed, but Father John could sense the presence of something dark lurking within her. As the exorcism began, Father John recited the prayers with precision and determination. Father Thomas sprinkled holy water around the room, and the group of family members prayed fervently. Margaret began to convulse, her body straining against the restraints. Her voice, now deeper, more menacing, spoke in riddles, taunting Father John with threats and blasphemies. At one point, Margaret's voice shifted, and she began speaking in perfect Spanish, a language she had never learned. Father John recognized the dialect. It was old, almost ancient, as if it belonged to another time. "Leave this child," Father John commanded, his voice rising with authority. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to leave." Margaret's body arched off the bed, her mouth opening in a silent scream. The room grew cold, and a sudden gust of wind knocked over the nearby lamp, plunging the room into near darkness. Father John didn't falter. He pressed on, reciting the final prayers of the rite. After what felt like hours, Margaret let out a blood-curdling scream, and then, just as suddenly, her body went limp. The room fell silent. Father John, exhausted but resolute, watched as Margaret's breathing returned to normal. Her eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in months, they were clear. The presence that had held her captive was gone. The Malones wept with relief, thanking Father John and Father Thomas profusely. Margaret, still weak but free, looked around the room, confused but calm. Father John, though relieved, knew that the battle against such evil was never truly over. He had won this fight, but the darkness would always be out there waiting for another opportunity. As he left the Malone house that night, Father John whispered a silent prayer, asking for strength in the battles to come. The circle. It started like any other night for Melissa Warner. She sat in her room, the soft glow of her computer screen illuminating the darkened space, headphones on, chatting with her best friends on their group call. It was a typical Friday night, with no real plans other than talking and maybe playing a game or two online. Her friends, Taylor, Beth, and Jordan, were all scattered across town, and they often hung out like this, virtually connected, yet physically apart. But tonight, there was something different in the air. Maybe it was the way the wind howled outside, or the strange static that seemed to come through the headphones now and then. "I heard about this weird website," Taylor said, her voice crackling slightly through the connection. "It's like a game, but it's super creepy. It's called The Circle." "A game?" Beth asked, sounding intrigued. "What kind of game?" Taylor's voice dropped a little, as if she were telling a secret. "It's supposed to be this urban legend. You join the circle, and if you follow the rules, you'll be fine. But if you break any of them, bad things happen." Jordan laughed. "Oh, come on, that sounds like some made-up internet crap. What's supposed to happen?" "I don't know all the details," Taylor replied. "I just heard people talking about it online. They said it's not like anything you've ever seen. Supposedly, you don't play the circle. It plays you." Melissa felt a shiver run down her spine. She wasn't superstitious, but something about the way Taylor was describing it gave her the creeps. "Let's try it," Beth said suddenly. "Come on, it's probably just some dumb site. We'll play for a few minutes, get scared, and then laugh about it." "Yeah," Jordan agreed. "What's the worst that could happen?" Melissa hesitated, but curiosity got the better of her. "All right," she said, "let's do it." Taylor sent them the link, and Melissa clicked on it, her screen going black for a moment before a single white circle appeared in the center. No title, no instructions, just the circle. "Is this it?" Beth asked, sounding unimpressed. "Hold on," Taylor said. "I think we have to start the game first. Everyone type your names into the chat and press enter." Melissa's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she typed her name, Melissa, and hit enter. One by one, the others followed suit. Taylor, Beth, and Jordan. The circle on Melissa's screen began to spin slowly and a new message appeared in the center. Welcome to the circle. Follow the rules and you will be rewarded. Break the rules and you will face the consequences. What are the rules? Jordan asked, sounding more interested now. Another message appeared. Rule 1, do not leave the circle until the game is finished. Beth chuckled nervously. Well, we're all stuck now. Rule 2, obey the circle's commands without question. Melissa's heart started to race. Okay, this is getting weird. Suddenly, a third message flashed on the screen. The game begins now. For a few moments, nothing happened. The circle on her screen spun lazily, and Melissa could hear her friend's nervous breathing through her headphones. Then a new message appeared. Taylor, stand up. Wait, what? Taylor's voice was uneasy. How does it know I'm sitting down? Just do it. Beth urged. It's probably some kind of weird trick. Taylor sighed, and through the faint sound of her microphone, Melissa heard the shuffle of movement. Okay, I'm standing, Taylor said. The circle stopped spinning, and a message flashed. Good. Beth, turn off your bedroom light. Beth hesitated for a moment, but then Melissa heard the click of a switch, and Beth's voice came through. Done. Jordan, open your bedroom window. Jordan groaned. It's freezing outside. But after a pause, Melissa heard the creak of a window being opened, and Jordan's voice followed. There? Happy? Melissa felt her stomach twist as the next message appeared. Melissa, go to your front door and open it. Her heart pounded in her chest. She didn't want to do it. Something about this game felt wrong, but she didn't want to be the only one to back out. Slowly, she stood from her desk and made her way down the dark hallway, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She reached the front door, hesitated for a moment, and then turned the handle, pulling it open. The cold night air rushed in, and she stared out into the empty street. Nothing moved. I did it, Melissa said, her voice shaking slightly as she closed the door and hurried back to her room. When she sat down, the circle on her screen spun faster. Another message appeared. Good. You are all doing well. The game continued for what felt like hours. The commands grew stranger and more unsettling. Taylor was told to hide under her bed. Beth was instructed to hold her breath for a full minute. Jordan had to take a picture of himself in the bathroom mirror and send it to the group. Finally, a new message flashed on the screen. The final round has begun. Only one of you can remain in the circle. What? Taylor's voice was panicked. What does that mean? Choose who stays. The others will leave. No way, Jordan said, his voice shaking. This is messed up. Guys, I don't like this anymore, Beth whispered. Let's just stop. But the next message appeared before anyone could respond. Melissa, choose who stays. Melissa's hands trembled over the keyboard. No, I can't. You must choose or all will be punished. Her mind raced. Her friends were silent, waiting for her decision. She couldn't do it. She couldn't choose. But the next message flashed, 10 seconds to choose. The timer began to count down on the screen. Panic surged through her, and in a blind moment of fear, she typed, Taylor. The circle on her screen spun faster and faster until it abruptly stopped. The words the circle has spoken appeared, and then her screen went black. Taylor? Melissa whispered into the silence of the call. Beth? Jordan? No one responded. Melissa waited, staring at the dark screen, but the call remained eerily silent. She tried to reconnect, to send messages, but nothing worked. Then her phone buzzed. A single message lit up the screen. You're next! Her heart froze. It has been a somber week. I accidentally hit a dog that darted into the road while I was driving. I wasn't speeding. She struck my back tire, so I didn't have to choose between braking, swerving, or continuing forward to avoid a worse accident. I pulled over, wrapped her in my daughter's pink towel with little bear ears on the hood, and held her as she passed away without a sound. Maybe T.S. Eliot was wrong after all. My first instinct was to call my father, but he's been gone for almost 5 years now. It's strange how, even after all this time, I still haven't broken the habit of reaching for the phone to call him whenever I'm in trouble. That got me thinking about memory, ghosts, and what remains with us after death, what we take and what we leave behind. I reached for Eric Rosenthal's They Walk in the Night. a collection of South Africa's most famous ghost stories, and began rereading it. It took me back to slumber parties, giggling with friends, eating sweetened condensed milk straight from the tin, and scaring ourselves senseless with ghost stories. South Africa has been inhabited for over 100,000 years, so it's no wonder there's an abundance of ghostly tales woven into the landscape. But today I'll focus on the haunting of South Africa's oldest colonial building, the Castle of Good Hope in Cape Town. Constructed by the Dutch between 1666 and 1679, the castle has been the setting for many ghostly encounters over the centuries. Among the most famous spirits is the Grey Lady, who haunted both the castle and government house. She was said to travel through a collapsed tunnel between the two buildings, but after a female skeleton was unearthed in the castle grounds in the 1940s, the Grey Lady was never seen again. Then there's the story of Governor Van Noot, whose cruelty left a haunting of his own. He died suddenly in his chair just as 7 prisoners he'd sentenced to death were being hanged. Unlike the Grey Lady, Van Noot's spirit is said to be more aggressive, even dislodging plaster from the ceiling and muttering about the sad state of his office. But my favorite tale from the castle comes from 1947, when members of the Union Defense Force, stationed there at the time, reported a sighting that left even the toughest soldiers quaking. Over the course of 3 nights in July, an 8-foot-tall, semi-transparent apparition was spotted on the ramparts. On the first night, the guards approached the figure in a coordinated pincer movement, but before they could reach it, the ghost leapt off the battlements and vanished into thin air above the old moat. 3 nights later, the same figure was seen again. Determined to rule out any possibility of a practical joke, Corporal Boonzair enlisted the help of Private Snagans to haunt the battlements while draped in a sheet, but the soldiers weren't convinced. Their laughter dispelled any notion that someone in a sheet could be responsible for the eerie sightings. On the final night, however, the ghost reappeared, this time ringing the bells in the guardroom. The troops, now fully terrified, stopped laughing and found themselves drenched in cold sweat. When Boonzair filed his report with the commander of the castle, the military police were instructed to keep an eye out for pranksters. But with no instructions in the military code on how to deal with ghosts, they simply carried on with their duties, leaving the mystery unsolved. In times of grief and loss, it's the ghosts of our memories that linger the longest, isn't it? It was one of those late summer nights in the small town of Elk Hollow when the air was still thick with humidity and the crickets chirped incessantly. The kind of night when everything felt alive, but you weren't sure if that was a good thing. 4 teenagers, Amber, Kyle, Lizzie, and Trevor, sat huddled in a circle around a small bonfire in the clearing near the woods. Amber was the ringleader. She always had been. With her sharp wit and fearless attitude, she was the one who suggested they do something different for once, something to break the monotony of their lazy summer nights. So, here's the deal, Amber said, pulling out a worn old deck of cards from her backpack. This is no ordinary game. These cards belong to a witch, an actual witch from the old days. My grandma gave them to me, said they were cursed. Kyle rolled his eyes. Come on, Amber, you don't actually believe that stuff, do you? Amber shrugged, a sly smile on her lips. Doesn't matter if I believe it or not. The question is, do you? Trevor, always the skeptic, laughed. Witch cards? Seriously? What kind of game is this? The witch's Uno? Lizzie, sitting quietly next to Trevor, shivered a little despite the warmth of the fire. She didn't believe in ghosts or curses, but something about the cards made her uneasy. They were old, the edges frayed, and there was a strange energy in the air since Amber had pulled them out. It's called the Witch's Game, Amber said, flipping over the top card of the deck and placing it on the ground between them. It was a black card with a single white symbol on it, a circle with strange markings. Okay, so what are the rules? Kyle asked, leaning forward. Amber's smile widened. There are 3 rules. Rule 1, we each have to take a card from the deck, one at a time. Rule 2, whatever is written on your card, you have to do it no matter what. Rule 3, you can't stop playing until the deck is empty. Lizzie glanced at the deck nervously. And if we break the rules? Amber's eyes flickered with excitement. That's when the witch comes for you. The group sat in silence for a moment, the crackling of the fire filling the air. Then, with a shrug, Kyle reached forward and grabbed the first card. He flipped it over and read the writing out loud. "Stay silent for the next 5 minutes." Kyle smirked and leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. He didn't seem fazed at all, but Amber was watching him closely, her eyes glinting in the firelight. "Your turn, Trevor," Amber said, pushing the deck toward him. Trevor rolled his eyes again, but picked up a card. He looked at it, then frowned. "Go to the edge of the woods and wait there for 2 minutes." Amber raised an eyebrow. "Well, what are you waiting for?" Trevor stood up, grumbling to himself as he walked toward the edge of the clearing. The others watched as his figure disappeared into the shadows, the light from the fire barely illuminating his retreating form. "Okay, Lizzie, you're up," Amber said, holding out the deck to her. Lizzie hesitated. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked a card. She flipped it over and read it out loud, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell the group your deepest fear." Her heart pounded in her chest. She didn't want to do this. She could feel Amber's eyes on her, waiting, expecting, but a cold dread filled her as she remembered the rules. She couldn't refuse. Taking a deep breath, Lizzie looked at her friends and said, "I'm afraid of drowning. I've had this nightmare since I was a kid, sinking into the water, and I can't breathe. I can see the surface, but I can't reach it." The group was silent. Even Kyle, who was under the rule of silence, looked at her with a newfound seriousness in his eyes. Amber nodded approvingly. "Good. Now my turn." She picked a card and flipped it over, her smile faltering for just a second. Then she read aloud, "Choose someone to leave the game." Kyle's eyes widened. He couldn't speak, but his face was full of disbelief. Lizzie's heart raced, and even from the edge of the woods, Trevor called out, "Hey! No way!" Amber's grin returned, more wicked than before. She looked around the group, her gaze lingering on each of them. Finally, she pointed at Lizzie. "Lizzie, you're out." Lizzie's blood ran cold. "Wait, what does that mean? I'm just done playing, right?" Amber said nothing, her smile fading. The fire crackled louder, the shadows from the trees growing longer, almost as if they were closing in on the group. And then, from the edge of the woods, a scream ripped through the air. Trevor came stumbling back into the clearing, his face pale as death. "Something's out there," he shouted. "I saw it! It's coming this way!" Kyle jumped to his feet, finally free from his 5-minute silence. "What are you talking about?" Trevor's eyes were wild, his breath coming in short gasps. "I don't know. It looked like a woman, but her eyes were all black." Amber stood up, clutching the deck of cards tightly. "You're lying." "I'm not lying," Trevor yelled. "It's the witch. She's coming for us." Lizzie's mind raced, her fear growing with every second. The rules. They had broken the rules. The game wasn't supposed to stop until all the cards were drawn, and now... Suddenly, the fire flickered, casting long shadows across the clearing. The temperature seemed to drop instantly, and a thick fog began to roll in from the woods surrounding them. "We have to keep playing," Amber said, her voice shaking now. "If we finish the game, maybe." Before she could finish, there was a rustling sound from the trees. The group froze, their eyes locked on the dark forest beyond. And then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. She was tall, her face obscured by the hood of a long, tattered cloak. But her eyes... they were completely black, just as Trevor had described. And as she stepped closer, the firelight caught her face, revealing a twisted, grotesque grin. Amber dropped the cards, her voice barely a whisper. "The witch?" Without warning, the figure lunged toward them, her long, claw-like fingers reaching out. The group scattered, each running in a different direction, their screams echoing through the night. But Lizzie didn't run. She stood frozen in place, her eyes locked on the witch's black gaze. A voice echoed in her mind, her own voice, repeating the rules of the game. Finish the game, or face the consequences. As the witch drew nearer, Lizzie knew there was no escape. The library was never quiet, not really. Even when the lights dimmed and the air felt like it could press you flat against the bookshelves, there was always a hum, a whisper, maybe a heartbeat that pulsed through its endless corridors. People came and went, most of them with a purpose. They knew where they were going, what they were looking for. But then there were those who came for a different reason, the ones who weren't sure if they wanted to be found again. My job was to keep track of them all, Most days, it was easy. A few hours of wandering the stacks, checking on the shelves, listening to the murmurs of the watchers. They saw everything, but today things had gone wrong. Someone was missing. 6 hours. I had been searching for 6 hours, and not a single soul had checked out. It was unusual, worrying. Most of the time, if someone wandered off, I'd find them in a corner, nose deep in some obscure text, eyes glazed over as if they'd forgotten what the real world looked like. But this was different. This one had crossed the tape. The tape. The very thought of it made my stomach churn. Hazard tape, bright yellow, warning people to stay away. But this place, it was a maze, and the more forbidden something was, the more enticing it became. Some people couldn't resist. I had to go back to my desk to prepare. The broom closet was where I kept the necessary supplies for ventures beyond the tape. The helmet came first, heavy, old-fashioned, like something out of a deep-sea diving suit. I hated wearing it, but it was essential. There were things beyond the tape, things that shouldn't see my face. The light on the front of the helmet would help, but it was also a beacon, a signal that I was out there, moving through their territory. And some of them, well, they like to play. Next was the sack, non-perishables, tinctures, aspirin. You wouldn't believe how many times I'd seen explorers driven to the brink of madness just by the pressure of this place. There was the compass, too, but it wasn't like any compass you'd find outside these walls. The needle didn't point north. It pointed to other things. Lastly, I strapped on the flamethrower. A small one, sure, but effective. You'd be surprised how often it came in handy. The creatures in the library didn't like fire. Most of them. I wasn't the librarian. I was just an assistant. But I had been doing this long enough to know how to survive beyond the tape. I only called for the head librarian if things got truly dire. And they hadn't. Not yet. The tape wasn't far, thank God. Sometimes it moved on its own, shifting deeper into the library, making my job harder. But today, the watchers had kept it in place. They knew I was coming. The air grew heavier as I approached, the lights dimming even further. I crouched, crawling beneath the crisscross of reflective strips, feeling the temperature drop. The tape wasn't just a warning. It was a boundary, a barrier between the library's known shelves and the rest. I felt the chill in my bones as I passed through, my lamp flickering as it illuminated the twisted spines of books on shelves that shouldn't be there. The watchers stopped here. Beyond the tape, there were only the listeners. I didn't like them as much. They didn't see, they only heard. It made things less predictable. I walked for what felt like hours, though I knew had only been a few minutes. Time was strange beyond the tape, stretching and warping, bending itself to the will of the library. I felt the familiar pressure building in my temples, the telltale sign that I was getting closer. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a struggle as my vision blurred at the edges. I popped a couple of aspirin into my mouth, chewing them bitterly. I couldn't afford to lose focus now. My fingers tingled, and I knew I was getting close. The rocks at my feet shifted, rolling and tumbling toward a central point. Good. I was on the right path. I clicked the compass once, just to be sure, before stuffing it back into the sack. I didn't need it anymore. The breathing was the first thing I heard. Shallow, rasping, like someone was trying to pull air through a throat that had forgotten how. The rocks picked up speed, skittering ahead of me down a narrow aisle lined with books that hadn't been opened in decades. Their spines were cracked, their pages yellowed and curling, but they pulsed with life. I could feel it. Each step I took felt like it echoed 1,000 times over, reverberating through the empty space around me. There. In the distance, hunched over on the floor, was the lost soul I'd been searching for. A girl. Young. Maybe too young to understand what she'd gotten herself into. The book clung to her face like a leech, its pages fluttering against her skin as if it was breathing her in. Her body was thin, too thin, as though the life was being sucked out of her one page at a time. I approached slowly, carefully. The rocks were gathering around her, swirling in a strange, almost reverent dance. I felt a pang of sorrow for her. She hadn't meant to get lost here. None of them did. The book wasn't going to give her up easily. It never did. I pulled a vial from my belt, uncorking it with a sharp pop. The smell was faint, almost nothing, but the effect was immediate. The girl moaned softly as I poured a bit of the liquid onto the spine of the book. It shuddered, as if in pain, and the grip it had on her head loosened. I could hear its sorrow, its desperation. It didn't want to let her go, but it had no choice. "Come on," I murmured, knocking gently on the cover. "It's time to let go." With a final reluctant sigh, the book released its hold. I pulled it away, careful not to tear any more of her soul with it. The girl slumped against me, her eyes wide and empty, her skin cold. She wasn't all there yet. It would take time for her to recover, but she would. They always did, at least the ones I found in time. I carried her back, her limp body barely weighing anything at all. The dark closed in around us, but I didn't look back. I knew better. The library didn't like to be watched when it was rearranging itself. By the time we made it back to my desk, she was starting to breathe again. Real breaths this time, not the shallow wheezing I'd heard before. I laid her down on the couch, draping a blanket over her and setting the kettle on for tea. She would be fine. People like her always were. People like me? Well, we stayed lost forever. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share the video. See you next time.